All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Phenomenal Student Podcast. Today, we're doing a phenomenal spotlight on, I'm sure to be the next bestseller, Reading Strategies 2.0, which is the revised edition of the best-selling Reading Strategies book. So today, I have the author of that book, Jennifer Serravallo, here with me today. Ms. Serravallo, Jennifer, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. It's so nice to be connected with you again.
Awesome on my end as well. It's funny, even I guess I don't know if it's okay to say that I had the advanced copy of the book, being able to look at it. And so I was like, somebody was like, "Hey, man, you got I actually talked to a district lady for my district, and I was like, "Yeah, I got an advanced copy of the Serravallo book." She was like, "Man, I pre-ordered mine." Like, who do you know? I was like, I guess I know her. I guess
That's right. That's right.
very rare you get a teacher flex. That was one of mine. So this is a higher up in our district too. So she's like, I've already pre-ordered, so I guess that's one copy that's been bought. All right, so let's get to it. How did this book become a reality? I think the original was written, what was that, around 2014, 15, maybe I'm a little off on the date. So how did this book become a reality?
The first edition just far surpassed my expectations in terms of how many classrooms it got into and how widely it was used and loved by people. And I'm a learner. I'm always reading and studying. I'm learning from research. I'm learning from every moment I'm in the classroom with students and with teachers. I'm learning every time I'm listening to teachers' questions during workshops that I lead. And I just felt like after 7 more years of this deep study, I could do better. So I wanted to do an updated, dramatically revised version. It had to be massively changed to make it worthwhile. And so I started working on it. I'm going to say like 2020, end of 2020, beginning of 2021. I started working on it. And the first chapter I revised was chapter 3. And I just released that one for free. And then I continued working on the rest of the book. And so now 2.0 is available.
Well, I know last time we talked, you kind of mentioned how it was a little more difficult that you couldn't be in classrooms as far as being able to observe, and you pull small groups even when you go into classrooms. Right. How difficult was that around? Obviously, that's when COVID hit, and I guess technically we're still dealing with it, I guess you could say. So how difficult was that trying to put together a book that's dealing with classroom instruction with obviously a lot of teachers being virtual, and then I'm sure as consultants and things like that, you can't even go into schools yet. So how difficult was it putting a book together like that with those challenges?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, I'm in schools now. And so is my consulting team. I have a consulting team of 18 people who are in schools every week. And so at the very beginning, when I was rewriting, I did do a lot of the testing of these lessons online in conferences and small groups with kids. But then once I was allowed back in the classrooms, which was really maybe like second half of the last school year. And then my consulting team also helped me. And then I worked with a couple of people who created some of the charts in the new edition. There's over 200 new charts. So they were working in their classrooms, first grade classroom and a fifth grade classroom to pilot the lessons. So yeah, it was an added challenge. I'm not going to lie, but I was very determined to get this out as quickly as possible. So I just worked at it.
So I'm not gonna lie, one of the most impressive things I loved about the book was one, the teacher language of things to say. And one of the ones I've actually started to use, because I would say phonics is one I'm definitely, because I'm a comprehension person. That's kind of like my first love. But now especially being an interventionist, you have phonics is a big thing. I think one of your not chapters, one of your lessons is about going left to right. And I thought that was really good, just that teacher language. I normally tell kids to break it apart, look at the parts, that type of thing. But I've seen how effective that is just to tell them to go left to right. Because a lot of kids, especially when you're dealing with inflectional endings or something like that, they don't always do it. They'll just, miss that part. So I've seen that be very effective in the classroom. So, thank you for that strategy.
I'm glad you're already giving them a try and putting them in practice.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like that's why I started with the phonics stuff. And I was going, because comprehension is kind of my thing. So I kind of was like, well, I'll get to that one last. And then, so I went through the early reading and went through more of the coding pieces. I thought it was pretty excellent. So I've been able to use that language because it does help in that small group instruction, especially in interventions. And also one of the things I thought was impressive was the fact that you gave the research without it being heavy. And you normally can tell the people that are researchers because they get a big, heavy, long reference sheet, but you kind of gave the reference without it being something you can't understand, if you know what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah,
so
yeah. This was
go ahead.
this was one of my big jobs I gave myself with this update,
Mhm,
was to be really clear on the research foundations of every single idea in the book,
mhm,
but keeping my audience in mind, which is a busy classroom teacher. So I want them to know what's the research basis for this particular strategy. Sometimes, what are some additional considerations, let's say for multilingual learners or for students with IEPs? Like, what does the research say we need to be aware of when teaching this strategy? But give it in a very concise way that it doesn't overwhelm the page. It doesn't, yeah, you don't have to wade through pages and pages of research to get to the meat, which is, what am I teaching in my classroom tomorrow? So together, there's this repeated feature, for those of you who don't have the book, that's in the margin of every single page that provides a link to the research, as well as lots of citations in the introductory parts of each chapter and in the introduction of the book.
Well, and I kind of jumped ahead myself. I guess the next thing I was going to talk about is the early reading and phonics, and a lot of things were kind of present in your last book, but I definitely think that things about, teaching kids to look at certain parts of the book and those little small things that you have to do at that K level or even pre-K in some instances, I thought was very impressive. So, I guess maybe I'm jumping ahead again. So what kind of went into, I guess you say you revised that third chapter. We know all the stuff that is going on in education and all the back and forth on Twitter and different things like that. Coming with that early reading and phonics chapter, adding that to your book.
Yeah, so I always had an emergent reading chapter
Mm-hmm.
in the first edition, but it mostly leaned on research around research by Elizabeth Soulsby, where she looked at behaviors of students who were read to over and over and over again, a set of traditional storybooks, and the kind of behaviors that they used when retelling the story from the pictures, because these are children pre-alphabetic. They don't yet know their alphabet, but they're still getting a sense of story, developing their language skills, and so forth. So I kept some of the best of the strategies and revised them, but I also added in some strategies in that first chapter to help kids who are beginning to learn their alphabet. So working with alphabet books and learning letter sound correspondence. So that's a new set of strategies in the first chapter. I also added in some strategies around print concepts. So helping kids to understand how to approach the book, the parts of the book, like the spine, the cover, going left to right. Here's the picture, here's the words, this is punctuation, all those early print concepts. So there's a few more strategies in there as well. So I think it's just kind of that first chapter is just sort of wider in scope in terms of the different types of strategies in there. And then you were talking about the chapter 3, accuracy, which is helping kids with word level reading. And it's not a phonics program. Everyone needs a phonics program, but this is really meant to be a supplement to help kids to transfer what they learn in phonics to their connected text reading. So like you were saying, that reminder to go left to right, read part by part through the word, or actually there's a strategy for some of maybe the older readers that you work with in intervention, where they maybe look at the parts out of order and then go back left to right and read them all together, like when they're getting into more complex multisyllabic words with prefixes and suffixes and things like that.
Well, and I think, go
Yeah, go
ahead.
ahead. No, you go.
What I was gonna say is, I know the big quibble, I guess, sometimes with science for reading and balanced literacy people is like systematic phonics or analytical phonics. And I found as an intervention, I was like, why don't you just do both? And there are different stages. I work with older learners. I have second graders and third graders and different kids that are, at varying levels. So, yes, some kids do need that systematic, but once you're kind of, whether you're in guided reading or whatever form of method of teaching reading you do, they're going to need more of that analytical phonics on the spot. So I've never got, at this point, I don't get why you can't just do both, but that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of strong research support for systematic phonics. Sequential, obviously, is really important, that you have a really clear scope and sequence for how you're approaching it, that you're doing, interestingly, if you look at Dr. Aries' research, she talks about how at the higher stages of kids being able to analyze words and figure out what the words say, she does say that kids decode by analogy. That's one of the things that children do. So I think for certain kids that, yes, saying, oh, you know how to read this word, then this will also help you read this word, could be a really helpful tip to give them, and really helpful practices that you could do during your phonics program as well.
And I even can tell you as a particular student, I had I even worked with her last year, but she missed a little bit in the first semester, so she's still a tick behind. Because I do take pride in getting them there in 1 year. I'm not like a person who wants to carry it over, but what I even when I did a running record with her, she knew all her patterns and things like that. It was just that multisyllabic thing. And so that's where you, like you were saying, the word parts or being able to make analogies or those bigger word parts, that's where you kind of start transferring over. That student doesn't need systematic phonics at that point. They just need to know how to break apart those words. And that's where meaning does come a lot more into play.
Yeah, you actually exactly need to add in a little bit more around morphology and being able to understand roots and bases and prefixes and suffixes, the meanings of those word parts, as well as how to recognize them to break the word down and then blend all the parts back together. Then ultimately to figure out what that word means. So I don't know if you've taken a look at the vocabulary chapter yet, but that's a nice complement to the accuracy chapter. So the accuracy chapter is how do I decode the word and say what the word is, and then the vocabulary is how do I know what this word means. So they work together.
Well, I could say a lot of I know I actually came in with an intervention structure myself, and I put out a book myself, and a lot of what I used was based off of I think when we talked over the summer, you said you renamed the book. I guess at the time it was like the reading comprehension something. I guess I forgot off the top of my head, but I actually used that as far as like when I'm looking at what those kids need at that level, especially comprehension. Because I actually teach colloquialisms to my kids. So it's like, that's one of the things I know you said around that Q or P stage, they kind of need to know colloquialism. So I don't just teach traditional figurative language. I'll teach them some more of the slang that people use, because they do need to know what those. Now it might seem silly when somebody's walking by and I might ask kids what does throwing shade mean, but for one, it's funny to the kids, but at the same time, that's the type of verbiage they need to know at that stage. So that's what I'm teaching them. But it is engaging as well, so it's kind of a good little thing too. So I use that a lot. So trust me, I've read a lot of your stuff. I actually, when I saw your book last, I was like, man, we just got this sitting here. I'm like, let me look through this. This is very interesting. Because I'm a very database person, but I mean, reading levels are reading levels. It's pretty accurate, and I felt like your book was really good. So I would big up that as well. Tell people if they want to read something as far as on reading comprehension and where kids need to be at. I would, I guess, recommend that book as well.
You're talking about
I guess I'm hyping you right now.
the orange one with the map pin on the cover. The orange one, Understanding Text and Readers, that one?
Yes.
Yeah,
But like I said, it was before you renamed it. They had an older copy of it. And so I saw it. I was like, man, this looks interesting. And I like how it was broken down as far as on the reading level. So I went through, I was like, okay, they're supposed to be able to do this is this stage, this is this stage. Like, okay, so I kind of remixed, and it kind of matched up a little bit with what some of the stuff I was doing, but I even locked in even more looking at those levels, adding in colloquialisms and different things like that. So I kind of, but yes, anyway.
Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar with the book, what I tried to do, leveling texts is not super scientific, right? We have authors who create beautiful stories, and they're not writing to fit into particular characteristics of text. After the text is written, you can look at it and say, this one's a little harder than this one. And it's harder because the vocabulary is more challenging, the syntax is more challenging, the layers of meaning or the kinds of themes that this book deals with are more challenging, or whatever it is. So you can kind of like tell how books get harder. And so when I think about comprehension instruction, especially evaluating students' comprehension, I think about what is the text demanding of the reader? Right? What does the text have in it that the reader should be able to figure out? And then I can teach strategies to try to help the student understand those aspects of the text. So for example, in a very simple, beginning story a third grader might read, usually the lesson of the story is very clear, kind of hits you over the head what you should learn. But as you move into more complex text, by the time you're in sixth grade, now we have stories that have multiple themes, for example. We might see symbolism. We might see social issues being an important part of the theme. So you have to be able to be aware of like, what does the book have? And then therefore, what should I expect the student to be able to talk about if they're really understanding it? And then also as a teacher, what should I teach them to do? What are the strategies that I could teach them to clue them into the things that will help them? So, so those of you who, I just wanted to give a little background in case people haven't seen that resource, kind of what it's about. It's really about helping you understand texts, how they get harder, and then understand readers, which is their response to the text and whether they're understanding or not based on what that text has.
Well, one thing it really helped me as far as being able to see, because I taught second grade 1 year, and one thing they told me that kids move slower from J to M. But one thing as I started studying the book, I kind of your book, one thing I studied was the skills that they needed to know or the certain things they need to know at that stage. And I started realizing that at certain stages they really can move faster, whether it's K to M or N to P. Normally when they switch between grade levels, it tends to be like a little bit of a stall because you essentially going from one grade level to the next. But even I found during that stage, they actually can move faster. But during that second grade stage, of course, they're reading to learn. And then also that's where I feel the science of reading aspect comes into play. Because I've even seen it with my students this year. They have to be fluent. They have to have a solid vocabulary. They have to phonetically be pretty strong. So it's like all those things come together at that time. That's why they move slower. So you have to focus on all those components. So really looking at that and looking at what they need to know phonics wise, I was able to kind of like marry the two. So again, I would tell people you really should check out that resource. I know people talk about your strategies book, but I think that'll be a good resource as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I've kind of went down the flow as far as phonics and everything like that, but I like actually, and again, I'm going to talk about one of your strategies. Actually, when I do guided reading, I have a structure I use for guided reading. The first thing I do is do fluency, and the first thing I do when I'm starting with kids with guided reading is making the bumpy smooth. And then I know one I really liked you had in the book. It was essentially about matching the dialogue to the character. I thought that was really good in this particular book. But what kind of went into some of the fluency strategies that you put into the book this time around?
Yeah, so the fluency strategies, I'm really looking at expression, nation, emphasis. Which words in the sentence do I emphasize? How do I smooth out my reading and phrase my reading? And of course, a portion of fluency is going to depend on accuracy, which has its own chapter. And then the fluency chapter assumes accuracy and then takes it a bit further with the phrasing and the expression. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is one of the big updates in the book is that I reorganized the strategies in the chapters according to skill progressions.
Yes.
And in doing that and in kind of really articulating how does a child develop as a reader in terms of their fluency, I saw opportunities to add strategies in that weren't there in the first edition to sort of help smooth the transition from skill to skill to skill along this progression. So part of the additions that you're going to see in each of the chapters was because of that kind of analytical work that I did to articulate what's the progression of skills within a chapter and how does a student progress. So what are some new ones I added to the fluency chapter? Let me think. I think I added some about maintaining fluency when the reading is silent. We talk a lot about fluency with oral reading, but maintaining a pace and an expression in your head when you're reading silently and that transition to silent reading. I added some around emphasis. How do you know which words to emphasize? And not just because it's bold or italicized, but because when you emphasize different parts of a sentence, it can change the meaning of what that whole sentence is about. So it's a lot more of this layer of comprehension brought to my fluent reading and making sure I'm understanding so that I'm able to reflect that understanding in how I'm reading the sentences.
Well, obviously it's one of the main things I think, like of course, making those emphases. I think when people think of emphasis, they think of, you read and then, oh, why did the character do this? But obviously the way as humans, we study people's body language. And that's even one of the things I look at. But obviously when you're reading, kids can't see body language, but they can tell what the character says. Oh, they groaned or they look this way. Being able to do that while they're reading is very important. So as you're saying, like normally with poor readers, they just don't notice those things. They tend to, or they won't shift. Like good readers, they'll read and they're naturally just grown. Or I know I have a younger cousin. I was reading with him. He actually GT, but he was reading. He naturally growled when the character growled. Like I was like, what? I was like, wow, yeah, he don't need any help from me. And he was only in second grade then. So, but he's GT. But so you kind of can see those things. So yes, it is pretty awesome. Like trying to match, but it's sometimes hard to get kids to do it because they think it's corny or just they don't want to do it sometimes. Because I do voices, so I know how to switch up with the voices. So I think it does help because I do the voices, so kids are organically start doing it. It's kind of awesome. Even when you do it, they'll start kind of naturally doing it, and that's kind of what you want to see. So we touched on fluency. So I know you mentioned vocabulary. So obviously a lot of the strategies that you mentioned in your book are more dealing with that incidental teaching of vocabulary. So what kind of went into with your vocabulary chapter as far as like being able to kids to determine the meaning of words, I guess, through their reading instead of sometimes, being taught intentionally what the word means.
Yeah, so I think we need both. We need to
Mm-hmm.
have a really clear ability as teachers to choose words to teach children explicitly. So words from our social studies, from our science curriculum, words from our math curriculum, words from our fiction read-alouds even that are in some way connected to other words, like semantically map those words and figure out how do these words fit together. So we need to do that, but we also need to teach children how, when they're reading on their own, to figure out the meaning of a word that's new.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at a couple of different research foundations around. I talked before about morphology, understanding where this word came from, the root, the base, the prefix, the suffix, and understanding those word parts can help you figure out what that whole word might mean. I also talk about context and different strategies for using local context, so within that sentence, or broader context. And a lot of the strategies work in informational text reading, in narrative text reading, and you can develop vocabulary and build your vocabulary through that sort of awareness of words, and that you don't just breeze past it, but that you pause and try to figure it out. Not every word you're going to be able to figure out, on the run, but some you will, right? And some you can collect for later, or talk to a peer about it, or talk to a teacher about it. And those strategies definitely help to do that.
Well, and I think obviously as adults, it's not like we're actually being taught what words mean, but every once in a while, whether it's slang or anything we learn, most time is just through people, you're talking and then you're like, okay, this is what that means. But obviously if we're learning a different language, we need to be taught. I always tell people I understand truly somebody coming from a different country. I did a mission trip in Mexico and I was like, man, I was trying to order at Subway and I was lost. My head literally was hurting. I was like, man, this is frustrating. I was like, oh, I get it now. I was like, I can get it if you don't know the language. You don't even know what a word means. You're almost like, and even the school I work at is mostly Hispanic parents, and a lot of them don't speak English. So I'm almost having to need other people to translate. So I can see where it could be a little frustrating when people are trying to learn the language. They need to be explicitly taught what it means. But yes, you do learn best incidentally, I guess.
Well, and what you're touching on too is one of the things that's challenging about English is that we have words that mean different things depending on the context. The same word can mean something completely different if it's a noun, if it's a verb, right? You can have let's take the word dessert, right? We could think about dessert as a noun, meaning like a sweet treat at the end of a meal, or you can think of dessert like a verb, like you're going to desert, like a soldier deserts their troops, right? So that same word, a reader might know it one way, might know it as the sweet treat at the end of a meal, but when encountering it in a text meaning something completely different, they need to be aware, wait a second, this doesn't mean dessert like a cupcake. This has to mean something different. They have to be aware of the part of speech and how the sentence is constructed, and say, okay, this is an action word in this sentence. So what might it mean? And then look at the context and try to figure out, so based on what else is going on here and other characters' reactions to what's going on, what might this word mean in this context? So those are all strategies that we use to be able to figure out what the word means, looking at the part of speech, looking at the context and how the word is used, looking at other characters' reactions in that moment. You're also talking about figurative language. So they might know words, and like you said before, throwing shade. I don't know what throwing means. Like I know how to throw a ball. I know what shade means, like the shadow cast when light, is blocked by
they do
something.
that in a lot of those books, I guess. Even I never really just focused on it. I guess I never thought about the fact that they do use a lot of slang in those books. I probably just never thought too much of it because I know what they mean, I guess, but I just never. It's not really figurative language. A lot of times they are using slang, and I would say, as ironic you're talking about. I know the other day, and I actually put it kind of like on social media. I modeled doing the word chill, and I did both multiple meanings that day. Of course, when people say they're chilling, they're relaxing or something like that. Like I'm chilling, I'm chill right now, but also it can mean that it's cold. So that was pretty fun with the student. They're like, bro, I'm chilling. And then at the same time, they were able to go, oh, it's very chill, like that
Yeah.
type of thing. So that was pretty fun. But at the same time, they know what it meant. And then they know that that word can mean multiple things. So they understand that concept of that. So I think that's the hard part, obviously, with our English language, because I guess I'm learning about other languages. A word means what it means in another language, but in English, obviously, love means like 10 different things in our language. So it can be so many contexts. So yes, that is very difficult. And I guess that's why teaching can be very challenging at times. So I wanted to get to the Holy Grail. Everybody wants to know about comprehension. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, obviously a lot of your stuff is dealing with small group instruction, guided reading, and sometimes more novel study or book study. But I want to ask, how do you apply some of your strategies to more, because I like to analyze complex text, or dealing with more, if you're analyzing a text or something to that effect, how do you merge that with doing those type of strategies or using that type of style of, I guess, teaching reading?
So the strategies in the reading strategies book are really content
Mm-hmm.
that fit within any type of lesson. You can teach whole class, small group, one-on-one. You can also use the strategies to teach in complex text if you're going to do like an analysis type lesson or a close reading type lesson with a grade level text. You could also use it to support kids with their independent reading, which may be more accessible and less of a stretch for them.
Mm-hmm.
So the strategies in this book are really they're just content. They're the how-tos that sort of unlock the thing you want the student to do, whether it's figuring out how a character changes across the story, or inferring a theme, or determining a main idea, or understanding what details are most essential to include in a summary. So what I just named are a bunch of different skills, and the strategies are how do I get there? So it breaks it down into step-by-step how-tos. I actually don't really do a lot of work around guided reading. I like instead to use strategy lessons.
Mm-hmm.
So a strategy lesson, the difference is that I'm pulling students together in a group based on a common need. So I've identified that they all could benefit from the same work because maybe I've used my skill progression and I've determined, oh, this particular group of students could really use help. Let's say text features. So it's a whole chapter on text strategies for text features. Let's say that they tend to skip over the text features, or that they get the gist of what the feature is teaching them, but they're not really studying it or synthesizing what that feature shows with the rest of the text. So I might say these 3 students who actually, are very different in a lot of ways, maybe by the text that they're able to read independently, or even whether they are learning English as a second language or not. What they have in common is they tend to skip over text features. So I'm going to pull them together, and in the books they've selected, or in a text I've selected for them, I'm going to teach them a strategy for how to pause, look at the feature by itself, read the caption, understand that feature better, read the rest of the text, pull that information back to the feature, and then try to explain in a few sentences what that feature is teaching them. And that procedure, that step-by-step how-to, is a strategy, and then I might have them practice it. So that's a strategy lesson, is really just pulling kids together based on a common need.
Well, and text features, all that goes in so many things. I know I was working with some students this week, and they kind of been struggling, and I'm like, oh my God. But finally on Monday, they finally looked at the picture. I was like, how do you know that the characters are worried? Because they was like, oh, they're worried. I'm like, how do you know? Oh, their faces. Like, what about their faces? I was like, oh, well, their eyes are like this. And one of them like, oh, their hands are up like this. I'm like, oh my God, finally you get it. But again, that's text features and being able to look at everything and how it kind of interconnects. Because obviously, because here in Texas, of course, the STAR test, and I guess that was going to be my next question, dealing with test taking and things of that nature. You have to be able to analyze text features and all those things and how it ties to the author's purpose and all that good stuff. So obviously that's very important. So I guess my next question would be, did you have a lot of questions from people about how could you make your book where it can help people with test taking? I guess I'll just make it simple, help people with kids being able to pass the test, so to speak.
Interesting. No, I don't get too many questions about that because I don't really do a lot of work around passing tests. My focus is really on helping kids to be strong readers. And if they are strong readers, those skills will transfer when they're in a testing situation. So many of the strategies, I think, could be strategies that you remind students of. Like, I'll give you an example. from one of the chapters focusing on expository reading. Often there's like, I don't know about the STAR test, is about half and half narrative and expository.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, now in Texas, they just switched. I think they're, even though they said STAR 2.0 is probably a bit more aligned how the Common Core test is, or how most tests are, it's reading and writing now. So, and they have to respond to a text. So,
yeah.
so
So
yes.
So that means you've got to really understand it. If you're going to read it, understand it, and then respond to it, you've got to really understand what the text says. So there's some strategies, for example, that help kids to pause after a chunk of text and either sketch a picture or jot a word or two, then go back over all those jots that you've made and put them together to be able to figure out the main idea. This is like gold for kids that are taking tests, because one of the things that happens a lot on tests, well, kids get nervous, they tend to rush. If you're in a state where they're testing on a screen, research has shown that kids tend to read faster and with less deep comprehension than if they're reading on paper. I would,
they said adults too, actually. They say adults actually.
That's right.
We don't do as well with the screen. So
that's right. I love Marianne Wolf's, Dr. Marianne Wolf's work on this in her book, Reader Come Home. She talks a lot about this deep reading and the kind of the way in which digital reading can interfere with that. So anyway, for those kids especially, we've got to slow them down, and we've got to say, do not pass go, do not collect $200, right? Do not go beyond this chunk until you can either draw a quick sketch or write a keyword or a phrase to show. And if you can't write a phrase or draw a sketch, you didn't understand that chunk. So go back and read it again. And then as you move on, right, and you've got all these chunks, and then you can put those chunks together. That is so helpful for test taking. Or to look and see, again, I haven't done a lot of studying of the STAR test, but back when I was a classroom teacher and I taught in New York City, the kids took a state test in New York. Every single passage had vocabulary questions on it. Every single one. What does this word mean? Or what does this phrase, or figurative language, what does this phrase mean? So that's like a high leverage, if you can teach them how to figure out words from context, they've got one question right in every passage, right? And so again, leaning on the strategies from the vocabulary chapter, which help them anytime, not just on test taking, but anytime to be able to figure out words and phrases.
Well, I guess one thing I had to realize as a teacher, even with our STAR test, they might say that it's only 4 questions on the test, but say something like vocabulary, but it's really more questions than that, because just on that part of it, because you have character traits and feelings, that's vocabulary. Right. That's actually probably a bigger deal, because you can look the words up now. But even if they don't know what, I guess, character traits or things mean, they don't, because they have to show evidence as well. But what I've seen too, kids can look it up. So, but they're not going to look up every word when they're actually reading through a text. So I think that's where the problem sometimes more comes in. So what you're talking about, being able to determine meaning as you read, because they might be able to get that context clues question right, but then they might not know what 15 words in the text was, and they're going to bum the whole passage anyway. But I have found only when kids' vocabulary isn't that strong, they tend to miss those vocabulary questions anyway. But some of them don't take the time to actually look it up. They're too lazy sometimes. But that's just what it is. All right. So let's get to the big question. I'm sure the science of reading people are really looking in on. So how does your book kind of fit into this current landscape right now? We're kind of in a bit of, I guess you call it, reading wars again. How does your book fit in this landscape? Obviously, it's a little testy right now. So how does your book kind of fit in with what's going on at the moment in literacy?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we all need to be aware of is paying attention to research and making research-based decisions in the classroom. And that is ultimately, right, the idea of the science of reading movement is, let's look at what the research says, and let's make sure that what our classroom practices are informed as possible by that research. And so, one of the things we talked about at the beginning of this interview was the tremendous amount of research citations throughout the entire text. There's over 700 citations to peer-reviewed literature. I could not have done this without a research assistant. I worked with a man named Gabriel Della Vecchia, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan. First of all, he had access to these databases of research that I don't, because I don't have a university affiliation, and many teachers don't have access. If you want to go read an article on, best practices around fluency instruction, you just can't get it unless you have access through a university. That's the first thing. So he helped me have access, but he also helped me to access it because he helped me understand, the methods that were used in the study, whether they were good or not good. Is it a quality study? And we were able to sort through studies in that way. He helped me to summarize, get the most important information out of it. So that was just an invaluable partnership, and I just wanted to give him a shout out while we're talking about the research. I also think it's important as we have conversations about responding to research that we are looking at all the research. And so one of the things that this book has, that the first edition did as well, was just a very wide breadth of research that we should be paying attention to, from word level reading to fluency, to all the chapters on comprehension, vocabulary development, the emergent reading stuff, but also speaking and listening skills. So helping kids to talk about their books. There's a chapter on writing about reading, annotating, note-taking, synthesizing information, using words on the page, right, that a reader would be able to jot and think about in their notebooks or on sticky notes. All of this matters in developing a holistic reader, right? All of these different, whether you're looking at the National Reading Panel and the different pillars, or you're looking at Scarborough's rope and you're looking at the different threads, or you're looking at a simple view, and right, all of these models, right? All these different models tell us that all these things matter. So I hope that this offers teachers how-tos that help them with all the different aspects that they need to be thinking about to really be informed by the research. Yeah, so I think that's how it fits.
Pretty much just answered my next question. I literally had, what do you think your book offers? That's literally what the next question was.
Yeah, I think it offers just practical ways to turn research into classroom practice. So that we're not super bogged down with the studies themselves. We're looking at the transference of what does this look like when I'm actually saying it to kids in a classroom, or I'm prompting them and coaching them, or I'm creating an anchor chart in my classroom that shows them the steps they can follow so that they can be independent with these different practices.
So I guess we kind of talked about what you hope your book offers, but what is the overall impact that you hope your book has? Obviously, everybody wants to share the book, but what's the overall impact you want the book to have, as far as now you've been able to revise it and it's going to be in teachers' hands? I guess we'll get to that in a minute. What is the overall impact you hope to have with this book?
Well, I'm always trying to be helpful. So that's the first thing. I just hope it's helpful to teachers, because I know how hard teachers work, how busy teachers are. And we're in a landscape currently where there's a lot of teachers who were emergency certified, or there's a lot of classrooms that are even empty and are looking for teachers, and they have people who maybe didn't have a traditional training, right, that they went through. So I hope one of the things that this book does is it offers teachers, again, really practical, use it right away ideas in the classroom, no matter your level of experience. And I hope that for the veteran teachers, the more experienced teachers, this book offers them, again, just help with making planning more simple, reminding them of things. I hear from a lot of teachers, oh yeah, I knew a lot of these, but having them all in one place helps me really remember, and helps me quickly find, and helps me to streamline my planning, and also to get some new ideas based on some of the more current research that maybe they haven't had the time to read. Yeah, so I hope it's just, above all, I hope it's helpful.
Well, and I think just me reading it so far, I like just the teacher language of being able, like I said, the left to right, or it ain't got to be something that's big. Some of these books you read them, it's like you need to say like a whole page worth of stuff. For one, I don't even like talking that much. So it's kind of like, I like saying something quick and just get to the point and tell the kids using that explicit language. So I found it most helpful. Right? Yeah, it worked, honestly, because the teachers the kids are actually doing quite well with it when I tell them look left to right. Of course, look at the parts especially when those ending parts and things like that, because kids will guess, they'll say watching instead of watch. They'll do that a lot. So, making sure they do those type of things. So now I guess we'll get to, so when is and I was looking on your page, your Facebook page, you was talking about it's kind of varying release dates. Could you just talk about the release dates and when it'll be available to most people?
Yeah, so the regular book, like say with a regular binding, is supposed to be out January 3rd. So people who pre-order it from the publisher directly will get it January 3rd. But one of the things people ask for so much is a spiral binding option. So I've never done this before, but we made this in spiral binding. But the production on that's a little bit longer. Oh, you've hole punched yours. That's great. So the spiral binding is going to be out maybe a couple of weeks after that. And then folks in Canada, Australia, it'll be a few more weeks delayed just to get it out of the country. So yeah. So all January, people will be getting their copies, whether it's regular binding or spiral binding.
So, all right. So as any author, of course, you want people to buy the book. So, I mean, I'll endorse it because I think it's awesome. I've only read about 55, 60% of it, and it's been helpful already. So why should people buy your book?
Well, I think that what I've done with this update is make the decision-making of which strategies to choose for specific children or which strategies to teach to the whole class because they align to standards, made that process of deciding even easier. And those skill progressions that are at the beginning of each chapter, there's new assessment advice at the start of each chapter. And again, in an already super teacher-friendly book, I tried to make it even easier for people to be sure that the strategy they're choosing is the right strategy at the right time. There are, from the first edition to the second edition, more than 100 new strategies. The other 200 have been so dramatically revised, you might not even recognize them. Over 200 new charts, all completely rewritten. Getting started chapter. It's a big book, but you don't have to read it in order. You can skip around and take what you need, and hopefully be inspired to even create your own strategies.
I actually thought one of the charts you had, I'm not like the anchor chart person because my handwriting's horrible, but at the same time, so I don't ever do them. I always have somebody, one of the female teachers would get handwriting to do them. But like I think you had an anchor chart about like the vowel teams and then one about the words being grouped together. I think it was the OUS because that's the one that I think makes the sound, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. So I thought those were really cool. Like I said, I'm not the anchor chart guy, but at the same time, I thought those would be quite helpful. Even I was like, man,
shout out. Yeah, while we're talking about the anchor charts, I've got to give a shout out to Tiffany and Merity. They were my two helpers to make all these charts. I did some, but those are better. They have really beautiful handwriting, and Merity is an amazing illustrator as well. Actually, they really both are. So they draw like really helpful visuals, like pictures and sketches to help kids remember what the steps of the strategy is. And I hear so often, my handwriting's not good, and that's what's keeping me from making my charts, or it takes a lot of time to make my charts. So one of the other things we're doing, and we just made this decision, so it's not going to be out for a little while, but I'm making a flip book of the charts available separately, like a little tabletop flip book, so that you can flip through and just show the chart as written with the beautiful handwriting in this book. So that'll probably come out in the spring at some point.
Yeah, even I had thought about would it be available because I actually like to just project stuff sometimes or print it out. So, but even I guess that's good. I guess if it's in a flip book, you can kind of do the same thing. So awesome.
And your kids don't care if your handwriting's perfect or not, by the way. You can just go ahead, just try your best.
No, I just project. I just get something online to project. I don't do anything. I got a couple in my room, but I didn't do any of them. But I mean, I give them anchor charts. It's just like I normally just put it on the screen or I print it out and put it in like their notebook or like a mini anchor chart or something like that. But anyway, guys, this has been an excellent interview. I will personally endorse the book because I've already read most of it and it's already been helpful. It's not like I just read it and was like, oh, it's awesome. I've actually already used some of the interventions. I've seen some of the impact of it. I want to dig a little deeper into the comprehension and see how I can embed that when I come back to school. So I just want to thank her for this book because I think it will be very helpful and I think it's something that you should buy. So I just want to thank y'all for listening. This has been a phenomenal spotlight with Jennifer Serravallo on Reading Strategies 2.0. Thank you for listening.